Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now on Monday, 100 members of the Afghan security forces were killed in an attack carried out by the Taliban. The assault began on Monday morning when the attackers rammed a car full of explosives through a military checkpoint and detonated the vehicle inside the campus of the National Directorate of Security Forces Training Center in the Wardak province. This is being seen as one of the deadliest attacks, and it's corresponding with efforts by regional powers to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table as efforts are underway to end this horrible 17-year war in Afghanistan. Now, to talk more on what exactly is happening on the ground in terms of the efforts being taken to stop the violence, we have Mr. Sethi, the former head of the Afghan Government Media and Information Center. Mr. Sethi, thank you so much for joining us here on Newsfire. This has just unfolded. It is one of the most deadliest attacks that have happened on Afghan soil against the security forces. How are you seeing this development in light of what has just transpired with talks between the Taliban to be conducted in UAE in the coming weeks?
Having these kind of attacks is not unknown on Afghan soil since that 2001, but it's tragic and really a bad news for the Afghans while the peace process or the negotiation struggles going on and has been pushed by the regional power, especially the initiatives that are the United States and Pakistan and other countries. They are trying to bring them to the negotiation table. I think since 2 weeks we have that the Taliban are conducting such an attack in Afghan capital, and yesterday we saw that they are conducted tragic attacks on the Afghan security forces in Wardak, which caused a lot of lives. So, from my perspective, from the political side, there is an encouragement environment has been created regarding to the peace process with Taliban. All the regional players, including Pakistan and other countries, they are insisting to bring or to support the peace process, which has been launched by the United States since months. But still, there is needed to push the Taliban to decrease their violence against Afghan security forces.
So, Mr. Sethi, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but when you say there is pressure on the Taliban to stop the violence as these peace talks are underway, what concrete efforts are being made? Isn't there a significant stance the Taliban are taking with the increase in violence in Afghanistan while peace talks are going on?
So there is, from the Afghan perspective, especially the Afghan government and the Afghan nation, they want Taliban to stop their violence at least when the peace process are moving forward. All the parties, include the United States, are trying to push Taliban to accept at least the ceasefire, even for 3 months or 6 months. And within this period, it will that will help that all parties will come together and start talking about their forward steps which needed in the peace process. But some of the analyses are saying that the Taliban are not ready now, for at least for now, to decrease the violence, and both sides, the Afghan government and Taliban, are trying to settle their ground position where that will support them on the negotiation table.
And here I'd like to welcome another guest who will be speaking on this issue. Welcome to Newswire, General Ijaz. He is a defense analyst and expert in the region. General Awan, could you shed some light at this critical juncture where the Taliban has been escalating violence in the past few months, but this is being seen as the deadliest attack, where 100 people from the Afghan security forces have been killed in a car being rammed into the spy agency's training camp. How do you see it at this point in time? What does this reflect on the mood of these peace talks going on?
Well, this is very unfortunate when there is an offer of dialogue and America has accepted their position in the region and they have entered into a direct dialogue with them. So this strike looks really ominous and badly timed. But I also doubt that the strike, the nature of this strike, because there are forces within America who are trying to undo the offer of President Donald Trump. And they are not really in sync with his policy of withdrawal, and they don't wish to agree with him. So if that is the kind of thing, then maybe we may expect another strike in the area, which may claim some more lives to undo the entire plan of withdrawal of American forces. Nonetheless, this strike is very badly timed and it should not have been there.
Right. And there's also this conversation that is going on where the U.S. Special Envoy, when he comes to this to the negotiating table, he has made a couple of statements, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, which kind of give a very poor impression of how serious they are as mediators. One of them was that the U.S. will continue to fight where their involvement is needed. Now, this is, again, being reflected as poorly by a certain number of experts. How do you see it at a time where the Taliban are very clear in saying that you need to withdraw your forces from here and we need to completely not amend, we will not back on this stance?
Well, this is understandable because one must understand one thing. When you enter into a dialogue from a position of parity and not from a position of strength, then you have to listen to the demands of the Taliban, Afghan Taliban. They have been saying two things all along, and they have resisted the presence of so-called coalition forces in Afghanistan for 17 long years. And this has been their position, that American forces have got to do nothing in Afghanistan. They are not going to budge an inch on that. And secondly, they are not accepting the Ashraf Ghani government as true representative of the people of Afghanistan. So they don't wish to enter in a dialogue with the present government of Afghanistan. So if that is the situation and America is not showing any flexibility on that, I don't think the dialogues are going to be conclusive. But if America is willing and the American establishment is not trying to undo the commitment by the President Donald Trump, then there may be a headway and then some agreement can be reached in Afghanistan situation.
Right. Now, let me pull you back into the conversation, Mr. When Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad says that we will fight where we need to fight and we will respond accordingly in Afghanistan, do you see that the Taliban might be taking on the same stance when they plan such attacks on Afghan security forces?
Taliban doesn't stop or increase their violence against the Afghan security forces while the negotiation process was ongoing with the United States through sent by Zalmay Khalilzad. I will be not much agreed with the honor guest that the Taliban demands are about the international forces or the Ashraf Ghani government. What we are looking to bring Taliban to the negotiation table with the Afghan people. Their problem with their motherland, not with the U.S. Otherwise, why they are launching such tragic attacks at the Afghan security forces?
But the Taliban have refused to speak to anybody in the Afghan government, claiming that it is a U.S.-backed puppet government. How do you plan to bring them to the table or to speak to even the Afghan people when the representatives are the ones they have a problem with?
These kind of propaganda or blaming, it will not help either the Taliban or the Afghan side in either the peace process. We need now to support an encouragement environment that will push all sides to sit together and find out a solution for the last 17 years war. And that's why what we've seen from the United States, that they are more serious about talking or negotiating with Taliban. But finally, there is needed the Afghan dialogue among the Afghans. that will be the real solution for the war. We have seen the Taliban has ruled Afghanistan 6 years or 5 years, but there was war going on in Afghanistan. Why that was? Because there was not an Afghan settlement peace process. So we go back to these years? No. All sides or all parties in the region in inside Afghanistan doesn't want to go back. We need that all parties, including Taliban, should be part of the political solution, and they could be part of the Afghan political map in the future. And that's why all the Afghans are, including the government or the political parties, they are welcoming this peace process.
Right.
But if the Taliban or some others, they want to force the Afghans or implement their own agenda, I think that will be difficult to find out a real solution for the ongoing war.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Safi, for there. Coming back to you for our last question, General Awan, just trying to understand the situation here. There are a lot of narratives going on that everyone has their own agenda, whether it's the US or other regional powers who have a stake in this solution. But the biggest roadblock is not just the US withdrawing, it's also how to get the Taliban to speak to the Afghan government. What, in your view, will need to be done by everyone involved to bring these two together to at least start talking?
Well, let me tell you one thing. There is a solution in sight, which I see, and that's probably the only way forward where all parties must agree if they are really looking for a solution in the region. One is that there should be a national government representing all ethnic groups in Afghanistan for a period of, say, 4 to 5 years. So this national government should ensure stability because there are going to be problems once the Americans withdraw. So immediate withdrawal would create a vacuum, but Taliban are not going to prepare to accept American presence in the region for long. So before they withdraw, they should be given a time till the next presidential election where Donald Trump is likely to take this card to the people that have withdrawn the forces, as he had promised earlier. So if that is the situation, then probably the national government and this force, American force, should be replaced by multinational peacekeeping force under UN flag to ensure peace in the region for some time so that the national government catches roots and necessary preparations are made to harness the main ethnic groups as well as the regional powers should play their role to ensure stability in the region.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, General Awan, for your contribution there. And with that, let's take a quick short break and we'll be right back with more stories. Welcome back to Newswire. The second story we'll be discussing today is Kashmir. Now, Indian-occupied Kashmir continues to be a bloody battleground. Yesterday, there was an encounter in Budgam. Today, we're seeing a fierce gunfight break out earlier in the day between security forces and terrorists in Jammu and Kashmir's Shopian district. The attack comes just days ahead of India's 70th Republic Day celebrations. They're just a few days away, and as they prepare for that, there are ongoing battles going on with freedom fighters and Indian security forces there. There is also a belief that Hizbul Mujahideen commanders were attacked, were shot at, and are part of those who have been claimed to be killed. Now, to understand what exactly is happening on the ground, how the 70th Indian Republic Day is being coming under international light as the violence escalates in Kashmir, we have two of our guests who are joining us, with Mr. Mufti Islah, who's a journalist from Srinagar, who will be commenting on this, as well as Ms. Naima Major, who is also a senior journalist from India-occupied Kashmir. Let me start with you, Ms. Major. How are you seeing this escalation of violence, especially protest rallies being banned there, and once again the scene looking very tense?
I mean, what has happened yesterday and today, it's not a new thing for us. We've been witnessing it for the last 3 years on every day, and these encounters, killings, this has been a constant process for us. Situation is getting more grim. I think the one reason might be that the elections in India are coming for these parliamentary elections. Maybe the Hindu Nationalist Party, which we have seen in the past, talking more about nationalism, patriotism, and raising the emotions of the people and whatever is happening in Kashmir, that this party might think that this might give them more votes. And that's what's happening in Kashmir. And we've been seeing our boys every day, 3, 4, 5, 6 boys, civilians killed. And this situation is going on, and this is really now a serious concern, and this should be a serious concern for both the governments, India and Pakistan, as well as for the international community, which I think until now was silent, and there are some voices now raised by the United Nations. But I don't think the mayor's statements is going to bring any justice to Kashmiris.
The fact that the UN Secretary General's statement on Kashmir has pretty much announced that Pakistan and India need to come together and talk about Kashmir, it's again the same narrative that Pakistan and India need to come together. Who's going to put the pressure on India to address this as a big humanitarian crisis in the first place?
If you can see, yesterday, UN President, even in Pakistan, said that India-Pakistan needs to come together now because so much is happening on the LOC and so much is happening in the Indian side of Kashmir. But I don't think it's, taken serious by Indian government yet. Maybe because the Indian government is very much, involved in elections at the time, and so much is going on with this. But I think the European Parliament, America, and then the United Nations, if they all come together, and they have to put pressure on India to come on dialogue table, whether it is with Pakistan or whether it is with the Kashmiris itself. But so far, even Imran Khan, your president, who has offered for talks, but there is no response from the Indian side.
Mr. Islam, we're talking about how earlier on there was always this rhetoric that the international community does not do anything about Kashmir. It's become a redundant issue. People have become desensitized. Now we're seeing the UN Secretary General, the President of the UN High Commission, all of them coming together and saying the same thing again and again, that Kashmir needs to be addressed. But who will put the international pressure on India to address this issue? Do we have to wait for the elections in India to be over before anyone takes serious notice?
Absolutely, and I think your Premier Imran Khan had suggested that there should be a change, in the government, at least at the centre, whether Prime Minister Modi comes back or there will be a change in government, then things are really going to move. And he had indicated that, dialogue at this juncture would not be fruitful, given that this time there's this burden of elections, and every party in mainland India is trying to essentially woo voters and, entering into dialogue with Pakistan for BJP-led government would be extremely tough, given that, it's based its politics on anti-India rhetoric. And clearly, as Imran Khan had also pointed out, that they need to wait before some ice is really broken, especially on the contentious issue of Kashmir. One needs to wait for another 3 months because general elections are going to take place. Here also they're going to pre-elections because there's already talk about elections, that is assembly polls being held in the valley. And subsequently, if there are changes at both the places, perhaps then, negotiations will resume. At this juncture, I can tell you that relations between India and Pakistan, as you know, have been at lowest ebb. So clearly one needs to wait and see what happens at New Delhi and as well as in Srinagar.
Now, see, this is what's always happening in these conversations that we have with analysts around the world over Kashmir, is that we have to wait and see how the government forms in India. But just to get an idea of what exactly happens in these encounters on the ground, you report from Srinagar. Can you give us an idea what we miss out in the international media when when security forces go to comb an area for terrorists or freedom fighters or whatever you want to call them? What exactly unfolds? How do these gunfights break out? And where do the civilians stand in these encounters?
Look, these are different kind of encounters. The one which we witnessed some 10 years back. Nowadays, encounters are different and they're difficult also for the security forces. Given that what happens is that if, say, for example, they go in village A, then, when one of the encounters starts, large number of people mill around the encounter scenes because they want to really help the militants to escape from that area. There's a lot of, support for militancy in Kashmir, at least, if not in Jammu. And, people interfering with encounters and trying to safeguard militants is what we are seeing. And we've seen that even though security forces have been extremely successful in eliminating more than 250 militants in the valley, but recruitments have not really stopped. And these recruitments are something which are taking place inside Kashmir. Previously, India would blame Pakistan for sending militants as well as the ammunition. But nowadays, what we're witnessing is homegrown militancy. And it seems that while Indian forces have really been able to successfully eliminate some 400-odd militants in the last 2 years, but the recruitment is on, and it seems that on the ground it's a zero-sum game.
Miss Major, let me ask you this. You heard Mr. Islah's version of how this, what I understand is becoming more and more of an indigenous movement within Kashmir without any kind of help from any third party outside the borders. First of all, do you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, it's a fact, and it's an admitted fact. We should all accept that it's an indigenous movement. It was always an indigenous movement, even in the early 90s, because Kashmiris themselves were involved in the militancy at that time as well. And this time, maybe at that time, they would get training and they would get ammunition as alleged by the Indian forces or Indian government. But this time we see homegrown militants, homegrown boys who are attracted to this and who go to, just join militancy. Although they haven't got arms, they haven't got ammunition, they are poorly trained.
Another thing that Mr. Islah has pointed out that we've also come across in various news reports that come out from that area and from our reporting sources also is that the locals, the civilians are actively involved, taking a major risk of their lives, putting their children's lives in danger by protecting these freedom fighters or militants or whatever you may want to call them. Now, does this not reflect that while Indian security forces escalate these combing operations, these search operations, at the same time it's causing a vicious cycle to evolve where more and more people are getting involved in this movement? Ms. Major?
Are you Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Look, just Mufti was saying that people go and risk their lives to give an escape route to the militants who are being trapped by the security forces. So why are people doing this? Because there is a sentiment there in overall population that something has gone wrong in history, whether it is 47 or afterwards, and they want to have this sentiment to be heard. That's why whether there are homegrown militants or other militants are coming across the border, but a majority of the people think that we have a demand for something for which we should fight, whether we have a gun, whether we don't have a gun. That's why this sentiment is there, and people are going, people are doing these protests, people are coming out on the roads, and people are going to give escape routes to the militants, which we now call overground militants or workers, whatever you call them. But I think the sentiment is there, and people want this sentiment to be heard by one and all, whether it is India, whether it is Pakistan, whether it's an international community. That's why they get sort of means how to express their sentiments. And if it is to give escape route to militants, they think it is best for us. It will be heard.
Mr. Islah, let me ask you this. As in 1990, there was a big event that took place. 50 people were killed. It's the Gokadal massacre, as it's called. Now, that was a protest rally that was banned to take place recently, as a lot of people wanted to come out on the streets to remember or pay tribute to those killed. Now, when these kind of crackdowns happen, where the people are not allowed to express their feelings, is this something we see more and more happening? And how does it affect the public sentiment?
Public is naturally very agitated because, when they're denied freedom of expression, then they tend to be alienated more towards New Delhi. And precisely that is what is panning on the ground. And in fact, you're talking about these 3 incidents. This was not one incident. These were actually 3 incidents. As a schoolboy, I remember that 3 incidents took place. More than 100 people were killed on that particular day. But also, while this is the fact, there's another tragedy which has happened, and that is, the mass migration of Kashmiri Pandits. So again, were people living here in various localities of Valley, and they were also pushed out because apparently they were fearful of what was happening in early 90s. So that's another tragedy. This is a tragedy which has happened with the majority community, that is Kashmiri Muslims. And even today, that keeps on happening. You have diffused massacres almost taking place every month almost. There are a lot of encounters this year which are replete with, not only the armed militants getting killed, but also civilian protesters who reached the encounter site and were shot or maimed by Indian security forces. You have that aspect also, but at the same time, you have to also look at what happened in early 90s when some 3 lakh plus Kashmiri Pandits had to leave Valley because of the situation that time, and because they too were also fearful in that entire setting. So clearly, both the communities have suffered. But when you're talking about Kashmiri Muslims, more than 70,000 Kashmiri Muslims have been killed in a violence which is still festering, and it seems that there is no end really to finish this, because there have been no negotiations. The world has not been able to get India and Pakistan on a dais along with Kashmiris, who are the principal party in this dispute.
But what I don't to be able to get from most analysts when we're talking about this, when they say Pakistan and India need to come to the table to resolve the Kashmir issue, it doesn't seem very much that Pakistan's role is going to make any difference if Indian security forces in Indian-occupied Kashmir continue to shoot at innocent civilians who are out to express themselves. How is Pakistan going to play any role in trying to stop that violence?
Look, if you take a look at what India is saying, what New Delhi has been repeatedly saying is that Pakistan is abetting this militancy, the armed insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir. That is what India says. Pakistan has always been saying that they support them morally, and they don't really send in men or, for that matter, arms.
But that also goes by what the Indian rhetoric is. I mean, the current party is a hardline right. They support this view generally, and this is also how they get their voters. But it doesn't mean it's true, right?
Look, these are versions, and unfortunately, in the version of these two countries, it's the common Kashmiri who actually is caught in this crossfire. A Kashmiri at this juncture, after facing the wrath for around 30 years, wants a resolution, and a permanent resolution, which will kind of set him free from the daily violence that he faces. Clearly, that is not happening. And one way that's going to end is that when the world puts sort of, force, a lot of pressure on India and Pakistan to come on the table. I understand that you're saying that Pakistan, in fact, wants that there should be some kind of conflict resolution.
Right.
But perhaps, the world community needs to do more to bring all these three disputing parties on the table so that at least the lives of these people, that is poor Kashmiri, that's saved and that becomes better.
Right. Ms. Major, my last question, we're running out of time. Let me quickly get your version on this. Bringing Pakistan to the table is something, obviously, Pakistan, and this is not something I say, it's been in the news reports time and again, they want India to come and talk about Kashmir. But like I posed the question to Mr. Isla, how realistic is their role in resolving this? And is there any other way for India and Kashmiris to come to one peace process?
I think what Pakistan is doing at the moment, because we have seen the statements and the gestures of your Prime Minister, that's enough. If they can open the Kartarpur corridor, what is problem in Kashmir if they are going to open the more routes between Indian Kashmir or Pakistani Kashmir? Why are they reluctant there? But If you see the belligerence of the Indian side of the Indian administration at the moment for the last 3 years, because of there's the Nationalist Hindu Party, which is running the show at the moment, I think the best thing is now we have to wait for the elections and we have to see which government comes. And if it is again Modi government, then I definitely need an international community will have to be very tough.
How the presidential elections turn out in India will show exactly how Kashmir issue will be resolved. Thank you so much, Ms. Major and Mr. for giving us your valued opinion here on Newswire. And with that, let's take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Our third story for the evening is about one of the most active conflict zones in the world. We're talking about Syria, where 2 nights in a row, Israeli airstrikes have hit targets inside Syria in a tit-for-tat exchange that included the launch of a medium-range missile from the outskirts of Damascus towards Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Now, tensions between Israel and Syria have been on the rise since the recently announced withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. What does this mean about how Syria is going to turn out, especially when regional stakeholders are involved in trying to sort what has been going on for the past over 4 years? Now, for that, let's have our commentators on board. First of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Emmanuel Navon. He's a French-born Israeli political scientist and an international relations and foreign policy expert. And also we have with us again Mr. John Hassasu from TRT, a world expert and a Syrian region expert. Thank you so much for joining us here in Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Hassasu. How do you see these developments unfolding? Also, let me include the suicide bombing by ISIS that's taking place while Syria continuously is mired in violence. How do you see the tensions evolving between Israel and Syria?
Of course, Israel is following closely what's happening in Syria, and it's in some level is involved in what's happening in Syria. And the U.S. forces, which is in mostly northern and eastern part of the country, is in a close cooperation with the Israeli army and the intelligence as well. The latest attack, actually Israel conducted air and missile attacks before as well. But this time they officially announced that they did these attacks to some specific targets inside Syria. And that's because of 2 reasons. One internal, I guess, and the other one regional. The regional one is the U.S. announcement of withdrawal from the country. U.S., as you know, in last December, the President Trump announced that the U.S. forces will start to withdraw from Syria, and they will hand the case to local powers. And that's being discussed now at the moment, actually. Haven't been decided who will handle the case inside. So this is something, because it will create some kind of handover in Syria. So Israel needs to say, I'm here. The second reason is we are in election season. So next April, the first week of April, there's an election in Israel. And Benjamin Netanyahu wants to give a signal or a message to its own people and voters that they are strong and they are in control, specifically on Iran's threat and the situation in Syria. They wanted to look strong and leave no hesitation in the eyes of the voters. So I expect that these kind of attacks and let's say strong feedbacks will come up within the next months as well, due to the election situation in Israel and due to the withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Syria.
Let me bring in Dr. John. Let me ask you that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as our guest just spoke about it, Mr. Hassasu had mentioned, he's also been long criticizing Iran and that Israel is facing a threat from Iran continuously. But at the same time, on a personal level, he's also facing a threat of indictment, right? Also over corruption charges. And then there's the elections. Do you agree that maybe the escalation of attacks in Syria are also a way to design to like maybe bolster his fading credentials before the elections?
This is a speculation which is very often made before elections in Israel, but there's nothing to substantiate it. And as a matter of fact, Israel has been acting in Syria for many months, and what happened 2 days ago was, as you mentioned yourself, following a missile attack coming from Syria directed at Israel. So Israel is not acting, obviously, in Syria against Iran because of elections, since those military interventions have been taking place for many months. And I think also the policy of Israel is very clear regarding Iran, that Iran is building a ring of the military presence and control around the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and also in Iraq. But the threat to Israel comes mostly from Iran's presence in southern Lebanon via Hezbollah, the Shia organization that owns, according to most estimates, over 100,000 missiles directed at Israel. And of course, in the void created by the civil war in Syria since 2011, and especially after the announcement by the Trump administration to withdraw from Syria, Iran obviously is entering that void to build up its military presence in Syria, and that presence is directed directly at Israel. This was proven 2 days ago with the shooting of missiles from Iran towards Israel. And so, again, since Israel cannot count, obviously, on any other power, whether the United States or Russia, to keep Iran in check in Syria, it has to do the job by itself.
So, but this month, outgoing Israeli military chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, he claimed that Israel has carried out thousands of airstrikes against Iranian interests in Syria. But this is the first time we're seeing them overtly taking responsibility of the attacks. I mean, with what has happened, the attacks coming from within Syria itself, that is just one occasion. Or are you saying that all of these attacks that have taken place in Syria by Israel were a response, a defense mechanism? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, this is the first time, in fact, that we have evidence that Iran shooted missiles at Israel. And therefore, this is the first time that Israel admits openly that it acted against Iranian military bases in Syria, because it's a very clear message. The message is being sent here to Iran. If you admit openly and you're saying to the world that you're shooting missiles at Israel, you're going to pay a price for it. And this explains why Israel made the announcement publicly.
No, but that is fine. I understand that. But what I'm trying to say is, I'm asking you your take on when the Israeli military chief of staff says that we have continued to strike at different Iranian interests in Syria, thousands of them in numbers in the past year. There have been many raids that we've conducted. When he's going out and admitting that this is not, that we have been involved in this war, doesn't this kind of go back against the argument that this is just not for defense that Israel is dropping missiles in Syria?
Well, of course it's for defense. What else would it be? I mean, Israel, obviously, if Israel, those strikes are very costly in terms of money. All the strikes obviously are very costly. Israel is not doing it for fun. It is doing it because, as I said, those military bases of Iran in Syria pose a threat to Israeli security. And this is why Israel is active.
Mr. Sassu, what's your take on this?
Well, as I said, Americans' withdrawal from the region is a big effect, of course. And you mentioned the explosions that targeted U.S. forces in northern Syria, specifically at the Kurdish-controlled areas. So definitely there is something going on in the region. It's too early to tie it directly to some development that will happen in the future. But as I said, like, Israel wants to give a clear message that it's going to be there and it will reply to any attack. Before there were attacks, drone attacks, some mortar attacks, sometimes insurgents trying to crossing the border. They replied with the same method. But you know, like the U.S., like the Israeli officials officially claiming responsibility of this attack, of course, is going to show, is showing actually Israel that's going to take a clear action against this kind of any power or threat in the area.
So can we say, Mr. Sasu, can we understand it this way, that the Syrian rocket fire can be better understood as an Iranian attempt to create a new balance of power on the Israeli-Syrian front? Is that how we can see it also?
That's what I don't want to make. Like, it's so complicated. We can't really justify every single move with a simple explanation in the region. Since there are a lot of things going on backdoors. So I could only assume on what I see in the field. And that's what to me, it appears regional developments, including U.S. Position change in Syria, and the Israeli election, of course, has an effect on this.
Dr. Navon, let me ask you this. Do you see the American withdrawal from Syria as perhaps leaving a vacuum where all regional powers involved in this, all neighboring countries, are really going to suffer in the coming months?
Well, of course, it's a vacuum, and this is why President Trump has been criticized both in Israel and in the United States, and this is why his former Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, resigned from office. Accusing him of not only of leaving a void in Syria, but also of betraying the Kurds. And of course, when it comes to Israel, Israel obviously has its own military power to protect itself from the Iranian threat in Syria. So as far as Israel is concerned, the American presence in Syria did not make a big difference militarily, but it did make a difference psychologically, because it did convey to the Iranians that America was here also to protect its own interest and would not leave a complete void for Iran, Russia, and Turkey. Now this void has been created. So I would say that as far as Israel is concerned, the effect is more psychological than military, which is probably why Iran felt that it had a free hand to send out missiles, to fire missiles at Israel, and this is why Israel had to respond as it did.
Do you also see, Dr. Navon, that maybe there has been a shift in strategy by Israel, especially as the military chiefs of staff have seen a change? Do you think there is something like that also happening that reflects how overtly they are now taking claim of attacks that they're making in Iranian interests in Syria?
Well, this might be. As you know, Israel has a new chief of staff who was appointed last week. As a new chief of staff, he comes with his own vision of things, with his own strategy, and he might be advising the prime minister and the government on a different strategy than the one of his predecessor. That might be. But again, this is a new appointment. He was appointed, he came into office last week, immediately having to deal with the Iranian threat in Syria. And we will probably find out in the coming weeks if the new chief of staff really has a completely different approach to the regional threats in the region, especially coming from Iran and especially, of course, in Syria.
So, Mr. Sasu, how do you see it? Whether it's a political motive or it is a self-defense one, either way, it is ratcheting up tensions between Syria and Israel, something that the civil war in Syria is already not allowing the people to afford there. So how do you see this affecting the crisis in general? Where can we see it headed in the coming weeks?
That's we will see. That's something that we will see all together. But to me, like, this is, Iran was always in war with Israel, and it was always using the tools that it has to confront Israel somewhere, somehow. And the new thing is, like, in Syria, we are coming to a point that the solution is close, or there has to be a solution. So the U.S. taking a position, American troops in Syria might not be that big deal tactically for Israel, but in fact, Israel now as a state can't be in any any solution on the land. So the American forces and American intelligence is giving an opportunity for the Israeli defense system to somehow be there, or to have someone that is already connected to its defense system. So Americans are very important for Israel, not only psychologically, but at the tactical level, especially on field. It was like that in Iraq, and it is like this in Syria right now. So I assume that the withdrawal of the U.S. forces is affecting the Syrian or the Israeli strategy firsthand.
So, Dr. Navon, in your opinion, let me ask you the same question. How are we looking at this moving forward? The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights have said that 11 people were killed in this crossfire, including lots of Iranians. But while Syria's ally, Russia, has said that 4 Syrian soldiers have died in this, first of all, do you think this is a realistic figure? And then moving on, let me ask you, where are we headed with this kind of tensions on the rise in the region?
Well, you know, the question, where are we heading, this region and this country, especially Syria? Syria has been self-destroying itself for the past 8 years. This is where we've been heading so far, first of all. Since 2011, there has been a horrible civil war that has completely destroyed the country, made over 500,000 victims and millions, dozens of millions of refugees. A country that has completely imploded. That is where we've been heading until now. Where are we heading from here towards the future? I don't know, because nobody knows what's going to happen in Syria, besides the fact that the Assad regime has been maintained after many horrified acts of terror by the Assad regime against the different groups that were fighting him, thanks, of course, to the intervention and the support of Russia. But I do not see, regardless of Israel and regardless of Iran's military presence in Syria, I do not see any lasting political order in Syria, because the different factions don't really agree on anything, and they won't agree to join a government with Bashar Assad. And this, again, has nothing to do with Israel. Israel will not be part, obviously, of a future political order or lack thereof in Syria. What is certain, however, is that Iran is definitely going to continue and maintain and increase its military presence in Syria, and this presence is going to continue to be directed at Israel. And Israel will continue to protect itself. Israel is doing so in coordination with Russia, because obviously Russia has its own interest in Syria. This is why it intervened to protect Assad, but today, at least, there is a line of direct communication between Jerusalem and Moscow, and there is complete coordination between Israel and Russia, even though Israel and Russia understand that they do not have the same interest in Syria. At least they understand that they have to prevent a clash between the Israeli army and the Russian army. So that is what we can know for sure for the future.
Some experts are saying that the civil war has swung in the favor of Bashar al-Assad's regime. But at the other side, we're seeing what Dr. Navon is saying, that there are too many factions, there's too much disintegration, and Israel doesn't want to be part of this political setup of how Syria comes together. Do you agree on this, what he's saying, or do you believe that on the ground, the regime has won the war?
Well, as we said, like, Israel conducted a lot of operations inside Syria, but they never took responsibility officially. So officially now there is no Israeli involvement in Syria, but who knows unofficially? I mean, of course, Israel, being in that region, being that close to the problematic country of Syria, it is somehow in the game. And it's trying to follow its own interest through some other regional players, and in some other ways, possibly. But what we are sure is there is no in charge Syrian government. There is no government that in the standards that we know and understand. So that's why there are a lot of international powers inside Syria. Some came from abroad, some are neighboring countries, and they will all involve in founding a solution. And Turkey, for instance, at this moment is trying to push and gain some land inside Syria for the opposition, that they could have a say in their own country and could have a vote in the future if there will be an election in Syria.
All right. Thank you so much, Sasu and Dr. Nevon, for your contribution here on Newswire. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be seeing you tomorrow evening. Until then, stay tuned to Indus News. Goodbye.